Hi, it's Kelly from the Rogue MFA, and if you have been wandering the middle of your novel thinking, please send something for my characters to grab onto to pull them through to the end, you are not alone. The reason why this is happening, you're floundering around in this mushy-ass, flabby middle, is usually because of story structure. It's not that you don't have great ideas. You know exactly how your book is going to start. You know all of the nuances and the complications, and you know about this climactic, explosive ending. I have faith that you're going to get there, but it's just wandering around in order to make that happen. Well, lucky for us, we have a solution that's about 400 plus years old. Because back in the day, Shakespeare had the same problem. Only when he was charging people to come watch his play, he couldn't necessarily jack up that ticket price and expect them to stand in the pit for hours while he kind of fucked around in the middle of the story until he got to Act 5. So he has now the 5-act play structure. Now, typically this works really well for a plot-driven novel, and I am more of a plot-driven writer. But today, I'm going to talk to you about the 5-act play structure, what's supposed to happen in every one of those acts, about how long it's supposed to take, and I'm going to use a character-driven novel to show you that it can be done with any type of work, which means there's going to be some spoilers. We're going to be talking about one of my favorite novels, A Gentleman in Moscow. Now, it's been out for about 10 years, so if you haven't read it yet, I don't know what you've been waiting on, but if you have, a lot of this is going to sound familiar to you, and hopefully you'll be able to see exactly how this book pulls us through Count Rostov's story. Now, because A Gentleman in Moscow is longer than 100,000 words, it's not a debut novel, right? I'm going to be doing the math on each one of these acts as if it is a debut novel that comes in at about 100,000 words. So when you hear me talk about these acts, like it should be about 10,000 words or 10% of your book, that's where those numbers are coming from for this structure. Also, if you are the kind of person that is like me and the idea of a really structured story and if it feels too rigid and you're like, I am a pantser, there's no way I am going to follow you on this, Kelly, I want you to stick around until the end, because you can use this, and I'm going to show you a way that you can get the benefit of the 5-act play without having to adhere to it rigidly as you're drafting. And sometimes it's easier to use this 5-act play once you have an entire manuscript done. So without further ado, we're going to head into Act 1. So in Act 1, the most important thing that we have to set up is the inciting incident, which is like, what are we going to go do, right? So in Lord of the Rings, it would be, here's the ring, we've got to go throw it in the pit of fire, right? In The Gentleman in Moscow's case, it is, you are now sentenced to house arrest in the Metropole Hotel for the rest of your life. The stakes are also really clearly defined in that if Rostov, who's our main character, sets 1 foot outside of the hotel, he will be shot. So we know that this is it. Like, he's going to be trapped in this hotel for as long as this story goes on, or until he finds a way to get out. We also need to know the setting and the time. We're also going to need to know like the primary characters. Now, this first act is going to take about 10,000 words or 10% of your novel. So how this breaks down in A Gentleman in Moscow is that we know our inciting incident already. We're going to then meet some of the staff at the hotel because they're going to be along for the ride for quite a bit of this book. We're also going to meet some of the guests who are significant to Count Rostov's story, most notably Nina, a little girl who's about 9 years old and who also she's very mischievous, and she gives Rostov a master key to the hotel, which is going to show up later and be important. We also get a glimpse into the antagonist, a man named the Bishop, and the reason why we don't like him in the very beginning of the book, or the reason why Count Rostov doesn't like him, is because the man is just a terrible waiter. What a freaking snob, right? So we have that, but we also, again, have those stakes defined. It's life or death. Now, we're going to move into Act 2. In Act 2, our protagonist already starts to move toward the conclusion of the book. Yes, right here. So what happens in Act 2 is that we have to be introduced to the bulk of the characters, or at least about 90% of them. We also have to get the most significant complications to the conclusion of this story that are going to have to be seated right here. And this is going to cover about 30,000 words, or about 30% of the book. Now, what happens in A Gentleman in Moscow is that we meet Anna Urbanova, who is the willowy silver screen darling who ends up a relationship with Rostov kind of off and on. But the complication here is that she's not always in Moscow. So she's kind of here and there. We see her a little bit, but she's going to become a bigger player. The antagonist, who is the bishop, that terrible waiter, starts to become more of a threatening or a menacing presence, right? He gets promoted in the hotel, and this really kind of complicates Rostov when he starts to kind of actively poke at the Count because now he has more power. We also meet a man named Mishka, who is a revolutionary that Rostov knew to back before the Bolshevik Revolution began. And he's kind of a troublemaker, a rabble-rouser. He tells Rostov that he's dating a woman named Katerina. Now, this seems really benign in Act 2. And you can get away with this stuff because you're seeding things, right? It is absolutely not benign that we meet this man Mishka and that we know that he's dating this woman Katerina. So Nina, at this point in Act 2, is now 13 and she's about to leave the Metropole Hotel. This is complicated for Rostov because they've become really good buddies and he's kind of become fatherly to her in a way. They goof off. He doesn't have anything to do but kind of horse around in the hotel with her the whole time, and they get into all sorts of mischief together. So on the news that she's going to be leaving the hotel, he gets pretty depressed, and he's also starting to wonder how much longer he can do this. So he kind of hatches a plan to take his own life, only it is foiled and it doesn't go through. But again, here we're reminded of the stakes, which are life and death. Just a little bit of a twist on it. It's Rostov enacting potentially those stakes. All right, so now for Act 3. So in Act 3 is where things really start to heat up. We've hit the point of no return with our characters, and we start to really introduce a heck of a lot more complications and ways that are going to make resolving that initial inciting incident more complicated. This is going to take up about 20% of the story, or about 20,000 words. In A Gentleman in Moscow, what ends up happening is that Anna Urbanova, our famous movie star, ends up becoming a much more significant player in Rostov's life, and they're seeing each other much more regularly, and she's become kind of an anchor in the story. Rostov also decides he's got to come up with some sort of purpose for his life, so he takes a position at the hotel in the restaurant, because remember, he is nothing if not a gentleman. But he also starts to plan a lot of restaurant activities. He meets a lot of dignitaries. He is of the noble class. So he has all of these social graces that really kind of match up with the reputation of the Metropole Hotel, obviously, because he was staying there. He meets a man there named Osip, who asks him if he will teach him the ways of the noble class. And he says, of course, I'll teach you the manners. This seems very benign. It is not benign at all. Again, we're seeding some things to make the end of this really, really complicated. So at this point in the story, Nina is now a woman and she returns to the Metropole Hotel and she looks up the Count and she asks him if he will watch her little daughter Sophia for the afternoon while she goes to the police to find out how to get her husband out of a Siberian work camp because he was arrested. But the complication here now is that Nina is also arrested and never returns. So it's now Rostov's job to raise Sophia in a hotel that he can't leave. So as you can see, the complication here really gets dialed up. How do you raise a kid in a hotel when she's going to need to leave that hotel and you can't leave? Well, this is where our stakes get tested, because by the time Sophia is 13, this is still in Act 3, she has an accident and she has to go to the hospital to get stitches. She falls on the stairs and Rostov rushes her to the hospital and narrowly makes it back with the help of Osip without getting by the authorities. And they even say to him, listen, we know you left the hospital. So here, the stakes are tested again by the outside force. So we want to make sure that we understand, or your readers understand, that nope, that threat is still real. It's still alive. Just because a decade or so, or a couple decades have passed since then, doesn't mean that people have let their guard down. So that takes us into Act 4. So in Act 4, this is where the rubber really starts to meet the road. The revelations are going to come forward. Secrets are going to be spilled. We're going to put our characters in a position where they have to make a really hard choice. It's do or die. There's no turning back. I mean, there hasn't been any turning back really since Act 2, but right now it would be catastrophic. And there's just kind of no way. They're in between the rock and the hard spot, and this is where we want them. So in Act 4, this is going to take up about 35% of the book, or about 35,000 words. Now, in Rostov's case, Sophia, he has raised now. She's 17. She's become an amazing piano player thanks to her piano teacher, Victor. And she's now been asked if she can go do a recital in Paris. So they're kind of weighing the options of that. Katerina shows up at the hotel to inform Rostov that his friend Mishka has died. And she gives him a bunch of Mishka's writings that are really subversive. And this is where a secret is spilled. Count Rostov tells her, that poem, the whole reason why I was put in house arrest for writing some subversive poem, was really written by Mishka. Only now there's no way, and he took the heat for it, right? But there's no way to kind of rectify this. Mishka is now dead, but now he's in possession of this really damning material. At the same time, the bishop is now on a mission to make Rostov's life a living hell. So Rostov's choices are, he's got to figure out how to take the bishop out, which is not going to happen, or he has to figure out how to leave this hotel. Because if he gets caught with any of Mishka's writings, if the bishop finds out about this, he is dead. So that takes us now into Act 5 and how we're going to conclude this whole story. So in Act 5, we must conclude the inciting incident. In the beginning, it was house arrest. Don't you ever leave the Metropolitan Hotel. This is going to take up the last 5% of the book, or about 5,000 words. So in A Gentleman in Moscow, Sophia has decided to go to Paris and perform in this piano recital. And Rostov contacts and writes a letter to a man named Richard, who is an American living in Paris. Now, a while back, Richard had asked Rostov to be a spy, and Rostov had said no, he wasn't going to be a spy. But even so, they remained friends. But he knows this man, so he writes a letter to Richard. He also hosts and oversees a lot of things that are happening in the restaurant. And at this time, he's like, you know what? I'm going to make a seating chart of everybody who's at this restaurant party, right? All these heads of state, and it's going to indicate their positions of power and their relational power to each other. And it's kind of like a who's who of early Bolshevik Russian power. So I can give this to Richard. I guess I'm going to be a spy after all. So Sophia goes to Paris, and the night of her rehearsal, Rostov locks the bishop in the cellar so he can kind of get him out of the way. When Sophia is done with her piano recital, she takes a map that Rostov has made for her, follows it to Richard's house, gives him the letter, gives him the seating plan, and Richard in return jams the switchboard at the hotel, causing a big kerfuffle and a chaos among all of these guests at the hotel, allowing Rostov the chance to escape. Victor, the piano teacher, dresses identically to Rostov to help them get out of the hotel, and then once they get to the train station, to create yet another diversion so Rostov can get on the right train and get out of town. And in the very final act, Rostov ends up in his old family estate that he's waxed on about for the whole book, to find that it has been burned down. But who is waiting for him in the tavern but the willowy silver screen star Anna Urbanova? And the entire book then comes to a close. So while Rostov made it out of the hotel, Sophia defected to Paris. Rostov is with Anna Urbanova, and we don't know what's happened. It is a satisfying conclusion for all involved. So that's how those 5 acts work, and hopefully that's helpful. So if you've stayed around to the end, you're like, okay, but I don't want to plan all that out, Kelly. Here's what you can do. Take your finished manuscript, and you take all of those numbers, right? We know Act 1 is supposed to be about 10,000 words. Go dig through your manuscript at about 10,000 words and see what you've done. Have you set up the inciting incident? Do we know who the stakes are? Have you introduced all of the characters? We know what's going to happen. We kind of know the trajectory of the book. Has all of that happened that's supposed to happen in Act 1? And then just kind of keep going through by word count or by percentage of your book, right? And kind of see, well, did I meet the criteria for Act 2, 3, so on all the way through. So you can use it again as a planning tool or as a diagnostic tool. And I'm hoping that that's going to help you get out of mushy, saggy middle territory and get your characters from your dynamic beginning of your book through a really white-knuckled, oh my God, are they not sort of middle into a really satisfying conclusion. I hope that helps, and I'll catch you next time.